His reign was one of the quietest in American mob history, and that quiet made what came next all the more monstrous. On the night of March 21st, 1980, the calm that had defined Bruno's era shattered. The Don sat in the passenger seat of his car outside his row home on Snyder Avenue, his driver beside him, the street nearly silent, except for the faint sound of a television leaking through an open window. Bruno reached for the door handle, preparing to step out, unaware that his final moment had arrived. A figure approached the vehicle from behind, a shotgun gripped firmly beneath a folded coat. Before a warning could be uttered, before Bruno even sensed the threat, the gunman raised the weapon and pulled the trigger. The blast tore through the driver's window, striking Bruno with devastating force. Glass exploded like frozen rain across the sidewalk as Bruno's body slumped back in the seat, lifeless. Neighbors stepped onto their porches in shock, some screaming, some frozen, all aware they had just witnessed the murder of a mafia boss on their quiet residential block. The car remained still for several moments, smoke drifting from the broken window as the echo of the shotgun faded into the night, leaving behind a void that would soon consume the entire criminal landscape of the city. The funeral was somber, filled with men who moved in stiff lines, each one uncertain of where the next bullet might fly. Behind closed doors, the organization roiled with fear and speculation. Everyone understood what happened that night. Bruno had been murdered without the formal approval of New York's Mafia Commission, a breach of sacred underworld protocol. Such an act meant the Philadelphia family had splintered from within. Whispers spread rapidly that powerful interests in New York had supported the killing, or at least tolerated it, believing Bruno had become too soft, too resistant to entering the lucrative narcotics trade. Others insisted the plot originated closer to home, from men who had grown frustrated with Bruno's rule and were eager to seize the throne for themselves. No theory brought comfort. Bruno's assassination signaled that stability had died with him. With Angelo Bruno gone, the Philadelphia underworld shifted violently as factions scrambled to claim the leadership void. Philip "Chicken Man" Testa, Bruno's longtime underboss, emerged as the most natural successor. Testa was older, reserved, and deeply respected among the older generation of made men. But behind him stood a man far more dangerous, far more ambitious, Nicodemo, Little Nicky Scarfo, the family consigliere, whose reputation for violence stretched back decades. Scarfo, short and slight in stature, compensated with pure ferocity. He had ordered murders over insults, had beaten men to death for infractions others might have ignored, and had once been exiled to Atlantic City by Bruno himself because his violent tendencies brought too much heat on the family. Now, with Bruno dead and Testa elevated, Scarfo was suddenly positioned far closer to the center of power than ever before. The shift emboldened him. His smile in those days, thin and razor-like, betrayed his understanding that the Philadelphia Mafia was entering his kind of world, a world governed by fear, revenge, and relentless ambition. Yet Testa's rise was not uncontested. In southwest Philadelphia, Harry the Hunchback Rickobene, a veteran mobster barely 5 feet tall with a severe spinal curve, began testing the limits of his autonomy. Harry had long clashed with Scarfo and held deep contempt for his strict adherence to mafia rules. Where Scarfo was rigid and ceremonial, Harry was practical and unpredictable. He didn't tolerate disrespect and did not fear reputations. His crew ran gambling, extortion, and, crucially, drug operations, the very trade Scarfo despised as poisoning the honor of La Cosa Nostra. Riccobene's refusal to bend to Testa or Scarfo signaled the beginning of a fracture that would soon erupt into war. Meanwhile, Testa's regime struggled to unify the family. Despite Testa's sincerity and experience, the Philadelphia mob was no longer the same disciplined machine it had been under Bruno's quiet leadership. Younger soldiers admired Scarfo's lethal decisiveness. Older members distrusted the violence they saw creeping into every corner of the organization. Turf lines blurred as men argued over territory, profits, and allegiance. Amid this growing unease, Scarfo positioned himself behind Testa, like a shadow waiting to take shape, whispering strategies that favored aggression and punishment, urging him to respond to internal disrespect with the same deadly precision Scarfo himself exercised without hesitation. The instability reached its peak less than a year after Bruno's murder. On a quiet March morning in 1981, Phil Testa stepped onto the front porch of his modest South Philadelphia row home. His foot touched the top step, and a concealed nail bomb detonated beneath him. The explosion tore through the wooden supports, sending shrapnel through the air and hurling Testa backward in a violent arc. The blast left the chicken man dead within seconds. The smoke drifted upward, curling into the early light, as neighbors watched from behind curtains, horrified at the second brutal assassination of a Philadelphia mafia boss within a year. The city's underworld, once tranquil under Bruno, had devolved into an arena of open slaughter. Testa's murder triggered an earthquake throughout the organization. The captains, the men who controlled crews, rackets, and the loyalty of soldiers, gathered in discreet backrooms and private clubs to debate the future. Two names rose to the forefront as contenders for leadership: Pete Casella, whom Testa had appointed underboss, and Nicodemo Scarfo, the consigliere with deep ties to New York. Casella had seniority and the title, but Scarfo had momentum born from fear. Many believed Scarfo was the only one ruthless enough to regain control of the increasingly chaotic family. Others feared precisely that capacity for violence, worrying that putting Scarfo at the top would mean endless war. In southwest Philadelphia, Harry Rickabene sensed opportunity. He had disliked Testa and had long detested Scarfo. With the family divided, he seized the chance to operate more independently, strengthening his own faction and ignoring overtures from those urging unity. To Harry, neither Scarfo nor Casella represented legitimacy. He believed leadership belonged to those who controlled the streets, not those who chased titles. His defiance infuriated Scarfo, who interpreted every act of independence as an insult and a challenge to the traditional hierarchy he was determined to restore. Scarfo's mood darkened further as weeks passed. Allies whispered assurances of New York's support, strengthening his confidence. He began moving like a man already in command, summoning men to meetings, issuing instructions, and criticizing those who questioned him. His violent temperament, unleashed at last from the constraints Bruno once imposed, became the defining force within the family. Men grew afraid to displease him. Small mistakes drew harsh rebukes. Perceived slights drew whispers of threats. When Scarfo finally seized control of the Philadelphia Mafia, the transformation was swift and jarring. Diplomacy disappeared. Suspicion replaced trust. Every conversation carried the scent of danger. Those who had once navigated Bruno's peaceful networks now walked through Scarfo's minefields, uncertain which associates would still be standing in 10 months, or even 10 days. Scarfo encouraged younger, more reckless men, granting them responsibilities. Older members viewed with alarm. His policies invited conflict, and conflict rewarded those who embraced bloodshed. Yet the most immediate and volatile threat to Scarfo's reign came not from within his own camp, but from Harry Rickabene, who refused to kneel. As Scarfo pressed men to enforce his rule, Rickabene repositioned his crew for survival, strengthening alliances and preparing for war. Every meeting, every whispered exchange, every unexplained absence from the streets hinted that Rickabene planned not merely resistance, but retaliation. Those close to Scarfo recognized the growing danger. Those close to Rickabene saw an old fighter ready to challenge a new tyrant. Bruno had once held the organization together with a gentle grip, maintaining order through respect rather than fear. Now, with two powerful factions clashing beneath the surface, the Philadelphia Mafia stood on the brink of an internal war unlike anything in its history. The streets that once thrived under quiet rackets and discreet profits would soon echo with gunshots, betrayals, and acts of brutality that would make national headlines. The morning after Phil Testa's burial, South Philadelphia moved under a cloud heavier than the spring humidity. The scattering of old-timers on their stoop spoke in hushed tones, the kind usually reserved for wakes or indictments. Men avoided eye contact longer than usual, and soldiers who normally strolled through the neighborhood with casual swagger instead kept their heads down and their guns closer. Beneath the surface, beneath the trembling calm left by 2 mafia boss assassinations within a year, the city's underworld had already begun shifting. 3 men, each dangerous in his own way, maneuvered toward the vacant throne: Nicodemo, Little Nicky Scarfo, Peter, Pete Casella, and Harry, the hunchback Riccobene. Their ambitions were not spoken openly, yet every nod, every whispered conversation, every gathering carried the scent of preparation. Inside the funeral home during Testa's wake, tension hung between the floral wreaths like gun smoke. The viewing room was dim. The lights softened to cast a dignified glow on the polished casket, where Testa lay in a navy suit, his features carefully reconstructed, despite the brutal explosion that killed him. Men lined up to pay respects, but respect was no longer the currency being traded. Every handshake, every greeting, every glance carried political weight. Scarfo stood near the front, arms folded behind him, his small frame rigid with control. He wore a simple black suit, impeccably pressed, but his eyes gave him away, cold, calculating, burning with ambition he no longer bothered to hide. A few of Testa's older captains approached Scarfo with caution, offering condolences. Scarfo nodded in controlled rhythms, choosing his words carefully. When one captain muttered, "Terrible tragedy, Nick, terrible," Scarfo replied in a low voice, "Terrible things happen when men forget the rules." The captain hesitated, unsure whether Scarfo was referring to Testa's killers or the shifting tides within the family. But Scarfo's gaze had already drifted across the room toward Pete Casella, the underboss Testa had appointed not long before his death. Casella stood greeting mourners with a poised but weary expression. Tall, broad-shouldered, always slightly stiff in his posture, Pete had a way of commanding respect without raising his voice. To the men who preferred stability and seniority, Casella was the natural successor. His hands were not as bloodied as Scarfo's, and his reputation was built on longevity rather than fear. But Scarfo saw something else: weakness, or worse, a willingness to tolerate trades, like narcotics, that Scarfo despised. Casella knew that Scarfo considered himself the guardian of the old-school rules, and though Pete preferred diplomacy, he understood that Scarfo's version of the rules was increasingly warped by paranoia and ruthlessness. Casella caught Scarfo watching him and offered a polite nod. Scarfo returned it with the faintest of smiles, the kind that carried more threat than warmth. Later, when the crowd thinned, Pete approached him. The two stood near a corner of the room, just out of earshot of most attendees. Casella said quietly, "Phil trusted the two of us. He wouldn't want division now. We need calm heads." Scarfo's lips twitched. "Calm's good, Pete. Calm makes men sloppy, though. Phil wasn't sloppy. Someone made him vulnerable. Someone let that happen." Casella stiffened. "I hope you're not implying I had anything to do with." Scarfo cut him off with a whisper soft as sandpaper. "I imply nothing. I notice everything." Casella's jaw tightened, but he walked away. His face said nothing. His silence said plenty. Across the room, men parted subtly to allow Harry, the hunchback Riccobene, a path toward the casket. At 73, bent forward by a severe spinal curve, Harry moved like a small storm cloud, slow, dark, and impossible to ignore. His height may have been diminished, but his reputation loomed large. He had survived decades of bosses, betrayals, indictments, and street wars. He was not formally tied to either faction. He had carved out his own corner of the underworld in southwest Philadelphia, and he answered to no one, not even Bruno, when he was alive. For Harry, hierarchy was suggestion, not law. Harry stood before Testa's body with no expression, his sharp eyes briefly scanning Scarfo and Casella before returning to the casket. He spoke under his breath, just loud enough for the man beside him to hear. "He let that little bastard too close. Harry muttered, referring to Scarfo. Should have seen what was coming. The man beside him, a Riccobene loyalist, whispered, Scarfo's got New York behind him. They'll make him boss. Harry's face twisted in disdain. Boss? That dwarf couldn't boss a card game. Let him try. I'll run my neighborhood the same as I always have. Harry didn't fear Scarfo, and that alone made him dangerous. Scarfo watched Harry carefully throughout the wake, noting who approached him, who stood by him, who seemed loyal. When Harry exited early, limping slightly as he stepped onto the sidewalk, Scarfo's eyes followed him until he disappeared into the dim light outside. Scarfo muttered to Leonetti, He's a problem. He's been a problem. We'll deal with him soon. Later that evening, in a private room above a South Philly social club, Pete Casella met with two older captains. The room smelled of cigar smoke and old varnish, the table scarred from decades of meetings. Casella sat at the head of the table, his expression serious but steady. He said, We can't let Scarfo turn this family into a slaughterhouse. The men are nervous. Business is shaky. We need someone the commission respects. One captain nodded. And they respect you, Pete. Bruno picked you as underboss. You've been around forever. Casella sighed. Respect doesn't kill bodies in the street. And Scarfo, he's ready to spill blood over shadows. Another captain leaned forward. New York gave him the nod for consigliere. They always liked him. Casella shook his head. They liked him because he kept quiet, because Bruno kept him on a leash. Without Bruno, he's rabid. While Casella built alliances through conversation, Scarfo built them through intimidation. In a back room in Atlantic City that same night, Scarfo summoned several young soldiers, men eager to prove themselves. Philip Leonetti stood beside him, arms crossed, absorbing every word as Scarfo addressed the group. Scarfo paced slowly, speaking in a low voice that forced the men to lean in. This family needs discipline, he said. Phil Testa knew that. He understood rules. But some men in this family, he tapped his chest with two fingers, forgot that rules are what keep us alive. Those men will fall in line, or they'll fall. One soldier asked, What about Casella? Scarfo stopped pacing. Pete's a nice guy. Too nice. Phil kept him around out of loyalty. But loyalty isn't leadership. Pete wants to shake hands. I want order. Leonetti saw how the younger soldiers responded, not with uncertainty, but with admiration. Scarfo's ruthlessness gave them a sense of direction they had not felt since Bruno's death. Scarfo understood this. He fed off it. Meanwhile, Harry Riccobene returned to his territory in southwest Philadelphia, gathering his own men in a dimly lit basement beneath a row home that doubled as an after-hours club. The floor creaked above them as the last patrons left. Harry took a seat at a round table, leaning heavily on his cane. His men respected him not because he demanded it, but because he had earned it through resilience and survival. One loyalist spoke first. Harry, you hear what they're saying? They think Scarfo's going to be boss. Harry scoffed. Boss of what? He couldn't run a decent book if you spotted him the odds. He wants the title. Let him take it. I run my streets. Another man asked carefully, You gonna support Casella then? Harry slammed his cane on the floor. I don't support nobody who ain't supporting me. Casella's harmless. Harmless don't win wars. The room fell silent. Harry continued, softer now. This family's splitting, boys. And when it splits, we stay tight. We don't back either of those clowns. If they want my neighborhood, they can come take it themselves. Harry's refusal to acknowledge Scarfo's authority became the first major crack in the organization after Testa's death. Scarfo heard about Harry's remarks within hours. Word traveled fast through the city, passing from bookmaker to runner to soldier. When the message reached Scarfo, he stood motionless for several seconds before saying, That hunchbacked prick. He thinks he's outside this family. He thinks he's untouchable. Leonetti recognized that tone. It was the tone Scarfo used just before someone disappeared. The days that followed saw each of the three pretenders building their circles. Casella met with older captains, emphasizing stability and continuity. Scarfo built a crew of enforcers, men he could trust to kill without hesitation. Harry fortified his neighborhood, placing loyal lookouts on corners, reminding bookies who controlled the streets. Tension spiraled until even low-level associates felt it in their bones. A week after the wake, fate placed all three men in the same room again. It happened at a small gathering inside a social club, where several captains insisted on a brief meeting to show unity. Scarfo arrived first, flanked by Leonetti and Phil Testa. Casella entered minutes later, giving a polite nod. Harry arrived last, standing as tall as his frame allowed, eyes sharp as broken glass. The room's air tightened. Conversations halted. Scarfo broke the silence first. "We need order," he said. "Phil's death left a mess. This family needs a boss." Casella said evenly, "It had one. Phil made me underboss. Bruno trusted me." Scarfo's voice chilled. "Bruno is dead. Phil is dead. The streets don't care who got appointed what." Harry chuckled darkly, leaning on his cane. "You two arguing over titles while the city bleeds. A real boss doesn't need a title. He needs soldiers. You boys got any?" Scarfo snapped. "You're not exempt from this conversation, Harry." Harry sneered. "I've been exempt since before you were shaving." Casella raised a hand. "Enough. This is about unity." Scarfo shot back. "Unity is strength, but strength comes from fear, respect, obedience." Harry's eyes narrowed. "Strength comes from men who stand beside you when bullets start flying, not boys who talk big." The room held its breath. No fists flew. No guns were drawn. But the war had been declared, in silence, in stares, in words that would echo far beyond that night. The days after Harry Rickabain survived the phone booth ambush felt different in Philadelphia, like the air itself had thickened. Soldiers whispered about the 73-year-old gangster who had taken 5 bullets and still managed to rip the gun out of his attacker's hand. Some called it luck. Others called it fate. Scarfo called it insult. The kind of insult he believed could only be answered with an avalanche of bodies. Word of Harry's survival spread through the streets faster than any police report, and even before the newspapers printed a hint of the story, Scarfo had already moved to reshape the war in the way he understood best, through extermination. Inside a cramped meeting room in the Atlantic City jail, during visiting hours, Scarfo sat behind a metal table, hands clasped, eyes narrowed. Across from him stood Phil Testa and Philip Leonetti, both stone-faced as they listened to Scarfo's voice carry through the thick plexiglass. "They botched it," Scarfo hissed, each syllable trembling with restrained fury. "Wayne shoots the old bastard 5 times and the dwarf still takes the gun from him. You know what that looks like?" He leaned closer. "It looks like disrespect. It looks like weakness. We don't show weakness. Not in this family." Salvi didn't flinch. He had grown used to Scarfo's venom, but he understood the gravity. Whenever Scarfo spoke of weakness, death followed. Scarfo continued, quieter now, the dangerous kind of quiet. "Everybody connected to the hunchback. I want them gone, from top to bottom." He lifted his hand and made a small finger gun gesture. "It's this. All of them. Understand?" Salvi nodded once. Leonetti remained still, absorbing every word with clinical precision. When the meeting ended, Salvi left the jail with a heavy silence between him and Leonetti. Only when they reached the car did Salvi exhale, rubbing his hands together as if warming them after a long winter. "Nick wants a purge," he muttered. "He wants the whole damn regime wiped off the map." Leonetti stared ahead, voice low. "Harry surviving? That's what pushed him over. He thinks Harry embarrassed him." Salvi snorted. "He thinks everyone embarrasses him. Today it's Harry. Tomorrow it's some guy who sneezed wrong." But even as he spoke, Salvi felt the weight of Scarfo's order settle into his bones. This wasn't a simple hit list. This was a death ledger, and he was the one expected to write it. That night, Salvi sat alone in his apartment in South Philadelphia, a small place cluttered with clothes, newspaper clippings, and the faint lingering smell of gun oil. The dim desk lamp cast a yellow cone of light onto a wooden table where a blank notepad lay open. A bottle of red wine sat uncorked beside him, its level dropping as the minutes passed. He flipped the pencil between his fingers, staring at the blank page. Scarfo's words echoed again. Top to bottom. Everyone. He placed the pencil to the paper and thought of the first name that had to be written. Joseph Padula. Padula had helped Riccobeni run the Southwest operations. Padula had been there during the early meetings to resist Scarfo's rule. Padula had always been one of Harry's loyalists. Salvi pressed down, writing the name in large, forceful strokes. Padula stays, he murmured. Locked up or not, he's got to go. Next came Victor De Luca, Padula's close friend and another loyal Riccobeni soldier. Salvi wrote the name with equal force, the pencil digging into the paper. He's tied too close to the hunchback. Putting him down is putting pressure on Harry's lungs. Then he wrote Mario Sonny Riccobeni, Harry's brother, acting leader of the faction, smart, cautious, dangerous. The pencil hesitated only a second before Salvi added his name. Sonny's the head of the snake, Salvi whispered. Cut that off, the rest scatter. At that moment, the door behind him creaked open. Philip Narducci entered, followed by Nicholas Nicky Whip Milano. Both men looked exhausted, tense, ready. Salvi gestured for them to come closer. Nick gave the order, Salvi said without looking up. We're cleaning house, Riccobeni's whole crew. Nicky Whip raised his eyebrows. All of them. Salvi didn't blink. All of them. Narducci let out a slow breath. Christ, that's a list longer than a grocery run. Salvi cracked a cold smile. Then let's start shopping. He wrote the next name, Bobby Riccobeni, Harry's younger brother. Impulsive, reckless, loyal, someone who would absolutely come after Scarfo's guys if left breathing. Salvi muttered, Bobby runs his mouth too much, and he'll kill half of us if he gets the chance. Nicky Whip leaned over Salvi's shoulder. You sure you want to hit all of them? Even the fringe guys? Salvi looked up slowly. Scarfo said everybody. You hear him? Everybody. We slip once, and we're dead. You want to be the exception. Go ahead. See where that gets you. Narducci stepped closer. Who else? Tamburino, Salvi said, writing the name Sammy Tamburino. He flipped sides too many times. Nick don't like swinging doors. Nicky Whip nodded grimly. We'll handle him. Yeah, Salvi replied. He's a soft one. He won't see it coming. Salvi continued writing names, lieutenants, bookmakers, enforcers, drivers, men who ran messages, men who collected debts, men who cooked meals at Riccobeni safe houses. The list grew longer, more ominous, more irreversible with each stroke of the pencil. When he paused to take a drink, Narducci asked, And what about the hunchback himself? Salvi didn't answer. Instead, he turned to the final page of the pad and wrote the name Harry, the hunchback Riccobeni, in bold, deliberate letters. He underlined it twice. If he ever steps foot on the street again, Salvi said softly, he won't see the next sunrise. The men absorbed this in silence. Then Salvi began strategizing. He flipped to a clean page and drew simple maps of South Philly and Southwest territories, marking who lived where, who visited whom, and which spots were vulnerable. The map looked like a battlefield, drawn by someone who had no interest in peace. Padula's over near 9th and Shunk. De Luca shadowed him for years. Sonny's always close to Mario and a couple of those bookmakers. Bobby? He's unpredictable. We'll tail him. Give him time, he'll slip. Nicky Whip shifted uneasily. And the old man? We track him when the feds let him breathe, Salvi replied. But he's old, cagey. He ain't the first move, he's the last nail. Hours passed with the three men circling names, arguing kill logistics, mapping routes, debating weapons, cars, timing, and who could be trusted to pull triggers without hesitation. Sometimes they spoke over one another. Sometimes they spoke in quiet certainty. Mostly, they spoke like men who understood the war had already swallowed them whole. At one point, Salvi pushed away from the table, stretching his neck. This war's gonna end ugly, he said. Harry's stubborn. He won't bend. Scarfo won't stop. There ain't no diplomacy here. Narducci scratched his jaw. Diplomacy ended the second Wayne Grande pulled that trigger. Nicky Whip added, and the second Harry stayed alive. Salvi looked out the window, the night streets mostly empty except for the occasional passing car. Harry living through that hit? That pissed Scarfo off more than anything. To him, that ain't survival. That's disrespect. Later, Leonetti arrived to check on the progress. He glanced at the list, pages long now, and nodded with quiet approval. Salvi met his eyes. "Nick'll like this," Leonetti replied. "Nick wants it done fast, no delays." "Nothing slow about this," Salvi said. "We're going to hit 'em faster than they can bury each other." Leonetti studied him for a moment. "You know this ends with bodies stacked on both sides, right?" Salvi shrugged. "Better theirs than ours." Leonetti agreed silently, though the weight of what was coming sat heavy, even on him. Near dawn, Salvi finally closed the notepad, tapping it twice as though sealing a pact with fate. He stood, his body sore from hours hunched over the table, and looked at the men gathered around him. Narducci and Nicky Whip stood ready, their expressions grim but determined. Leonetti watched from the doorway like a sentinel. "This is the ledger," Salvi said. "Nick gave the order. We do it clean, fast, and without mercy. Anyone tied to Harry goes in the ground. Anyone hesitates, they'll join 'em." Narducci cracked his knuckles. "We start tonight?" Salvi nodded. "We start the second the sun drops." Before leaving, Salvi tucked the notepad into his jacket pocket, the list of men marked for death now resting inches from his heart. The weight of it felt heavier than a gun, heavier even than Scarfo's expectations. It was the heaviest thing Salvi had ever carried, but he carried it without trembling. The men stepped out into the early morning air, the sky still dark, the city still asleep. A breeze carried the faint scent of bakeries prepping for the day, the smell of fresh dough mixed with the smell of coming bloodshed. South Philadelphia didn't know it yet, but it was about to become a battlefield. The Rickabine War would spill onto sidewalks, into arcades, through phone booths and bedrooms, into alleys and markets. Bodies would fall in daylight and moonlight. Mothers would scream. Soldiers would disappear. The FBI would take notes until the streets ran empty. And it all started here, with one man, a stack of blank paper and a pencil sharpened to a lethal point. This episode closes on Salvi walking alone down the street, jacket buttoned, ledger inside. His shadow stretches before him, long, angled, almost blade-like. Behind him, the city sleeps. Ahead of him, the city bleeds. The 9th Street Italian market woke early, as it always did, with crates being stacked, steel shutters being lifted, and the familiar cries of vendors filling the morning air with a rhythm older than any gangster who ever walked the block. The smell of peppers, fish on ice, fresh bread, and exhaust mingled together into a tapestry that defined this part of South Philadelphia. To the locals, the market was a daily ritual. To the mob, it was a neutral zone, public, open, predictable. Too predictable, Phil Testa would later realize. By the early afternoon, the street was alive. Tourists drifted between stalls, old Italian men argued about soccer, and butchers hosed down concrete stained by decades of business. Salvatore Phil Testa, feared hitman, son of the murdered boss Phil Testa, and one of the youngest mob leaders the city had ever seen, stood out only because he didn't care to blend in. He sat on a wooden crate outside a seafood stall, a bowl of fresh clams resting on another crate turned sideways. He wore white tennis gear, casual and loose, as if he was simply another neighborhood kid enjoying his day. He cracked a clam open with his fingers, slurping it down before tossing the shell aside. His expression was relaxed, almost too relaxed for a man who had been inches from death for months. Vendors joked with him, familiar with his presence. Even comfortable with it. One seafood vendor called out, wiping his hands on his apron, "Sal, if you're going to eat all the profits, at least let me charge you this time." Salvi smirked, lifting a clam. "I'll pay you when you learn how to cook these right." The vendor scoffed. "Cook? You eat 'em raw like a barbarian." For a moment, the world felt normal. But beneath the surface, beneath the laughter and street noise, danger had already entered the market. Danger carried in the engine of a faded green sedan rolling slowly down 9th Street. Inside the car sat Joseph Padilla at the wheel, and Victor DeLuca beside him, each man gripping the edge of his seat, with the tense readiness of soldiers about to charge into enemy fire. They had been driving loops around the market for nearly 20 minutes, waiting for Salvi to settle, waiting for the crowd to move just enough, waiting for the clean shot Harry Riccobini wanted. Phil Testa had attempted to kill Harry. Salvi was the hammer of the Scarfo regime. Hitting him wasn't just revenge, it was declaration. Padula kept his eyes forward, heart pounding. De Luca held the shotgun low beneath the window, the blue steel shimmering faintly in the midday sun. "There," De Luca said, his voice tight. "He's still sitting there. Eat your clams, you little prick. Just sit still." Padula exhaled through his nose, adjusting his grip on the steering wheel. "We only got seconds once we turn," he muttered. "Make 'em count." De Luca racked the shotgun once. The metallic click was swallowed by the noise of the market. He breathed. "Harry wants this. Harry needs this. You saw how they came for him. 5 shots. He's still bleeding from it." Padula nodded. "Then we do it clean." When the car turned the corner, time seemed to slow. The sedan rolled past vendors, past crates of grapes and tomatoes, past hanging sausages and cheese wheels. Customers didn't notice it. Nobody did. Nobody except Phil Testa, whose instinct ticked like a metronome in his skull. A subtle engine hum. A tiny shift in the crowd's rhythm. His mind tingled. Something was off. Salvi paused with a clam halfway to his mouth. His eyes narrowed as he scanned the street. He saw the sedan. Saw movement in the passenger seat. Saw the muzzle emerging. Salvi whispered, "Ah, fuck!" The shotgun thundered before he could finish. The first blast tore through the air, exploding into Salvi's chest and knocking him backward off the crate. The clams flew across the pavement as his back slammed into the concrete. A scream cut through the market. Vendors dove for cover. Shoppers shrieked. Produce overturned, peppers and lemons scattering under flipping tables. The second blast ripped apart the wooden crate he had been sitting on, splinters flying like shrapnel. Salvi tried to roll, gasping, blood spreading across his white clothes in widening blooms. His mind raced. Move, move, move. But his body refused. De Luca pumped the shotgun again, yelling over the chaos, "Finish him!" Padula accelerated, getting closer. De Luca leaned out the window, sighting Salvi as he struggled to crawl behind an overturned plastic bin. The third shot hit the pavement inches from Salvi's hand, spraying debris into his face. The force of it knocked the wind out of him. He reached for his waistband, where a pistol was holstered, but his arm shook violently. He couldn't lift it. People were screaming everywhere, vendors ducking behind stands, women pulling children into storefronts, an old man crying out in Italian as he stumbled away from the carnage. The market had transformed from a buzzing neighborhood hub into an open war zone. Padula yelled, "Hit him again!" De Luca's face twisted with anger as he chambered another round. He leaned out even farther, the car swerving slightly as pedestrians darted away. The fourth shot blasted into a seafood display, sending crushed ice and broken shells flying across the street. A fisherman ducked, screaming, "Madonna mia!" Salvi's vision blurred. He tasted blood, hot, metallic, choking. He tried to drag himself behind a vendor cart, fingers slipping on the slick pavement. His mind flickered between consciousness and blackness. He heard the car speeding past him now, the engine roaring away. Heard De Luca's voice fading. "That's for Harry, you Scarfo piece of shit." The sedan fishtailed at the corner before disappearing down Washington Avenue. The market fell into stunned silence for a moment, long enough for the dust to settle, long enough for those who survived to peek over crates and counters. Phil Testa lay on the ground, half curled, blood pooling beneath him like ink spilled on white fabric. A vendor rushed to him, trembling. Sal, can you hear me?" Salvi's lips moved, barely. A faint wheeze came out, no words. His eyes rolled back, then forward again, then back. Another man shouted, "Call the cops! Someone call the fucking cops!" But there was a different kind of fear in the market. Fear of being seen helping a mobster who belonged to Scarfo. People hesitated. Moments passed. Blood flowed. Finally, a young delivery driver ran to a payphone, slamming his fist against the buttons as he shouted the address into the receiver. Before the ambulance arrived, 2 women knelt beside Salvi, one sobbing, one praying. "He's just a boy," the older woman whispered. "Madonna, he's just a boy." Sirens grew louder in the distance. 2 police cars screeched onto the scene, followed by an EMS van. Officers jumped out, guns drawn, expecting the shooters to still be nearby. As they assessed the chaos, paramedics rushed to Salvi. One paramedic pressed fingers to his neck, shouting, "He's alive! Weak pulse!" An officer surveyed the damage, the broken seafood stand, the exploded crates, the terrified vendors. He muttered, "This wasn't a robbery. This is Riccobini versus Scarfo. Jesus Christ, it's open season." Paramedics loaded Salvi onto a stretcher. Blood smeared across their gloves. Salvi twitched once, eyes fluttering, before going still again. As they lifted him into the ambulance, one paramedic said to the other, "If he makes it, it'll be a goddamn miracle." The ambulance sped away, weaving through traffic. Behind them, the 9th Street Market, usually loud, vibrant, alive, stood in a broken silence. Crates overturned, blood on the ground. Clams scattered like debris from an explosion. Not one person doubted what the shooting meant. It was retaliation for Harry Riccobene. Lightning answering lightning. Blood answering blood. News spread within hours. Soldiers from both sides whispered about the audacity of it, hitting Phil Testa in broad daylight, in the middle of the market, in front of dozens of witnesses. Back in Atlantic City Jail, Scarfo heard the news during afternoon count. His jaw tightened, eyes narrowing into dark slits. He leaned closer to Leonetti through the bars. "They shot Salvi," Leonetti said. Scarfo absorbed the words like poison, letting them sink deep before responding. His voice was low, controlled, deadly. "Hit them back," he said, hard. South Philadelphia was no longer drifting toward war. It was in it, fully, violently, publicly, and the bodies would only continue to fall. The ambulance tore across the Benjamin Franklin Bridge like a streak of red lightning, sirens screaming into the night as paramedics hovered over Salvatore "Salvi" Testa, their gloves slick with blood. Salvi drifted in and out of consciousness, his breath rasping like air squeezing through broken glass. The shotgun pellets had torn into his chest and side, shredding muscle and cracking ribs. Every bump in the road sent a shockwave through his body. But even through the haze of pain, Salvi tried to speak. One paramedic leaned close. "Save me," Salvi whispered, though he wasn't begging. He was commanding. They wheeled him into Jefferson Hospital under flashing lights, nurses already preparing blood bags and oxygen. A doctor barked orders. "Get him into trauma. Push 2 liters now," as the team flooded around the gurney. Salvi's head lolled to the side, eyes half open, watching blurry figures move with rapid precision. For a moment, memories flickered. His father Phil Testa smiling at a Sunday dinner, Scarfo's voice ordering the death ledger, Harry Riccobene's crooked silhouette. Then everything went white. Hours passed. When Salvi finally woke, he lay in a recovery room under harsh fluorescent lights. Tubes connected to his arms, a bandage wrapped across his torso. His chest rose with shallow, painful breaths. The world felt distant, muted, but he sensed movement in the hallway. Heavy footsteps, a door opening, a familiar shadow darkening the room. Nicodemo, little Nicky Scarfo, entered like a storm given human form. He closed the door behind him slowly, almost gently, as if trying to contain the rage boiling inside him. His small frame trembled with energy that had nowhere to escape. Philip Leonetti followed, expression cold, eyes fixed on Salvi, with the kind of loyalty only forged in blood. Scarfo approached the bed, staring at Salvi's bandaged chest. "You're lucky," he said in a voice that barely carried. "Lucky those 2 cocksuckers didn't aim better." Salvi tried to smirk, but the pain forced a grimace instead. "I should have seen him earlier," he rasped. "DeLuca, Padula, those fucks came right up on me." Scarfo's face contorted. "You got hit in the heart of our neighborhood, in broad daylight, while you were eating clams like nothing could touch you." He leaned closer, the venom rising. Harry Riccobene sent those 2 animals to make a statement, and they made it. Leonetti stepped closer. "We already got word on where DeLuca's been hiding. He won't last long. Scarfo slammed his fist against the metal rail of Salvi's bed, the sound echoing off the sterile walls. "Not long? Not long. They shot my boy." His voice cracked, not in weakness but in fury so intense it shook his entire body. "They shot you, Sal. You, my best man, my future." Salvi's eyes were steady, even through the pain. "I'm not dead." Scarfo's breathing slowed, but the fire didn't fade. He placed a hand on Salvi's arm, an uncharacteristic gesture. "You rest, you heal, and while you're lying here, we're going to answer this shot with a goddamn war." Leonetti nodded. "We already got lists from the death ledger. Names, locations. We're going to take the whole Riccobene crew apart piece by piece." Salvi swallowed. "Start with Sammy Tamburino. He knows too much. And Bobby Riccobene? He's stupid. He's hot. He'll run. Make sure he doesn't get far." Scarfo's eyes gleamed. "He won't." He leaned closer until his face hovered inches from Salvi's. "I promise you something, kid. Before you leave this hospital, the men who pulled the trigger on you will be buried in 2 holes so deep even the worms will need a map." Salvi whispered, "Good." Scarfo stood, straightened his coat, and turned to Leonetti. "Let's go. There's work to do." As they left the room, Scarfo muttered a final vow, spoken not to the world but to the violence that lived inside him. They wanted war. I'll give 'em a fucking war. In the weeks that followed the Italian market shooting, Philadelphia transformed into a city living in a heartbeat of fear. Soldiers from both factions began traveling in pairs, checking their rearview mirrors every 10 seconds, ducking into alleys when headlights followed too closely. The old code of silence had grown teeth, and every whisper carried the vibration of danger. Phil Testa lay recovering in Jefferson Hospital, but his presence still loomed over the streets, because the men who loved him, feared him, and followed him now carried the torch in his absence. They were known as Scarfo's young executioners, a new generation bred not under Bruno's diplomacy, but under Scarfo's ruthless doctrine. These men didn't negotiate, they didn't warn, they didn't hesitate. And their revenge began with Sammy Tamburino. Tamburino had once been loyal to Scarfo, then switched to Harry Riccobene's camp, then attempted to drift back, mistaking the war for a game of musical chairs. Scarfo didn't tolerate sloppiness, and Salvi, still bandaged in a hospital bed, had named Tamburino as one of the first to go. On a muggy night in southwest Philadelphia, Sammy walked into a small arcade filled with neon lights and the chirping sounds of old game machines. Children played pinball. Teenagers hovered over Pac-Man consoles. Sammy thought he was safe here. He was wrong. Philip Narducci entered through the back door, face emotionless, hands already tucked into his jacket. Fafi Iannarella followed him, jaw clenched. The arcade owner recognized them instantly and slipped quietly into the back room, locking the door. Tamburino saw them moments too late. He whispered, "Oh no." Narducci's pistol flashed. The bullet struck Sammy in front of arcade machines and teenagers, his body collapsing beside a claw machine filled with stuffed animals. Screams filled the room. Kids ran. One mother shielded her child as Sammy gasped for breath. Iannarella stepped forward, fired once more into Sammy's chest, and said softly, "Nick sends his regards." The 2 executioners vanished before police arrived. The next target was Bobby Riccobene, Harry's volatile younger brother. Bobby wasn't cautious. He moved openly, emotionally, furious about the attack on Salvi, but too impulsive to realize he was being hunted. When the young executioners finally cornered him near a fence behind a row house, Bobby tried to run. He climbed halfway up before Fafi shot him in the back of the head. Bobby collapsed, draped over the fence like a broken rag. News of his death hit Harry with the force of a hammer. His allies described him as a ghost with fire in his eyes. He tightened his grip on southwest Philly, refusing to bend, refusing to acknowledge Scarfo's rising power. But Scarfo wasn't finished. The young executioners fanned across the city, picking off anyone tied to Harry Riccobene in the death ledger. Salvi had written. Bookmakers disappeared. Drivers were shot in their cars. A low-level drug runner was found in a vacant lot, rumors suggesting he had begged for his life. No mercy was shown. none was intended. Leonetti coordinated operations from a safe house, directing crews with precision. Narducci and Nicky Whip executed most of the hits personally, earning reputations as the deadliest duo South Philadelphia had produced in a decade. Their efficiency became street legend, and all the while, Scarfo visited Salvi at the hospital, updating him on each kill like a father showing his son test scores. Sammy's gone, Salvi would nod, eyes cold. Bobby's buried. Salvi would smirk through the pain. More to come, Salvi whispered. Good. One night, after another hit made the news, Scarfo stood beside Salvi's bed and said, "You heal up. You'll be back out there soon, and when you are, Harry won't have a single soldier left." Salvi, exhausted but burning with vengeance, muttered, "Make sure DeLuca and Padula die last. I want 'em scared before they go." Scarfo grinned, a wolf's grin, already planned. The war became a machine, its gears grinding flesh, punishing every man who dared stand with the hunchback. The Riccobeni faction shrank, morale dropping with every body on the pavement. Some men flipped, some fled the city, some simply vanished from the streets forever. By the end of episode, Philadelphia understood what Scarfo's rule meant. This wasn't the diplomacy of Angelo Bruno. This wasn't the cautious stability of Phil Testa. This was blood-based governance, leadership through fear, reputation built through coffins. Salvi Testa, broken but recovering, symbolized the heart of Scarfo's violent future. And Scarfo's young executioners were rewriting the laws of the streets, one corpse at a time.